Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My name is Clayton Craddock, and today's guest is Damien Bassman, a legend of New York City. Welcome to the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast, Damien.
Thanks so much, Clayton. I'm super excited to see you and chat.
Where are you from?
I'm from DC area, from Northern Virginia. Fairfax is where I was born in North Carolina. I lived there till I was 3, but I grew up outside of DC in Fairfax, Virginia. So
when did you move to New York?
I moved to New York after grad school.
Let's go back to the beginning. You grew up in Fairfax. Did you go to elementary and middle school and high school there?
Yeah, all of it. Same hat my whole life. It was great. I was close to DC. We used to go hear, the National Symphony and the Airmen of Note and, the military band, jazz bands. My dad used to take me to all those concerts when I was a kid. So I got to see Lionel Hampton and Louis Bellson when I was a kid. Pretty amazing looking back, the people that I got to see. I was super lucky. I never got to see Buddy, but he came through there. And then also the National Symphony, we would go to all the outdoor summer concerts growing up. So it was pretty great. Yeah.
What got you started playing drums?
My parents were both amateur musicians. My dad played all the reed instruments, and he played in community theater and pickup orchestras. He still does that stuff now that he's retired. He does more of it. My mom played guitar and piano, like folk guitar. Like she used to do like protest concerts during this Vietnam War and stuff, like on college campuses. So they were both musicians. They gave me a bunch of toy instruments when I was a kid. I had a guitar, a piano, a drum, a trumpet, a clarinet, little toy ones. I liked the drum the most. When I was in the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, my dad signed me up for group drum lessons. After a year of that, the teacher said, "You show some promise. If you're interested, we should think about doing private lessons." So I started taking private lessons with him, half an hour a week. And he was my teacher from 3rd grade until I graduated high school.
Did you start out on the drum pad? The pad was
a slanted old Ludwig's metal pad with a thick slab of rubber. My teacher, Sam Evans, played in the Army band. He loved teaching. His teachers were Shelley Mann and Jim Chapin.
Oh, wow.
I get chills thinking about him. It was like he was, I don't know. I mean, I'm using this colloquially, but it was like he was like an angel in a human body. He was just pure positivity, and he taught kids all day long, 6 days a week. He and his wife had this group called the Patriots of Northern Virginia, which was a colonial marching group. They had groups for each age range. So like if you were a little kid, you just like marched with like flowers and like a little flag. And then when you got to the older thundering drums, which is what I was in, you played tenor and snare drums, and you would march and play this series of cadences. And then the older kids, there was a fife and bugle and drum corps. And it was just so cool. And every year, at the end of the year awards, we would do parades and things like that. They would have an award ceremony, and the Marine Band Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps would come and play. I don't know if you're familiar with those guys. They're still badass. They played on these old, huge rope drums, and they wore the colonial garb. No expression, no movement, just hands. These beautiful traditional hands. They just play traditional fife and drums. I don't think they have the bugles anymore. It was my dream to be in that group when I was older. Like that was everything I wanted to do that. But, I got those things change when I got older. But
to say, did you ever wind up playing in that group?
I didn't, because when I got older, they had solo and ensemble festivals for elementary school band and high school band. When I was in 4th grade, I did the solo and ensemble. The judge that year was Garwood Whaley, which you might recognize the name. He wrote a lot of the like Bibles of like primer, snare drum, mallet, and timpani handbooks, and owns Meredith Music Publications. He's really incredible. And he was the president of PAS for several years and Percussive Art Society. And he was the judge. And apparently I wasn't aware of it because I was in 4th grade and I played a snare drum solo. But he took my dad aside afterwards and said, if he's still playing drums in 7th grade, this is my information. Give me a call. My dad, being the Jewish father that he is, kept that card and in 7th grade contacted him. And I took my first lesson with him and left the lesson in tears because my main teacher, Sam Evans, who I kept taking lessons with the whole time, was just this like ball of love and positive encouragement. And Dr. Whaley was much stricter.
Was he like the teacher in that movie Whiplash?
No, he was nothing like that. That was my high school band teacher. That movie Whiplash was very real for me. When I saw that I was in the fetal position, like, are you okay? And I was shaking. This was my life.
Wow.
But anyway, he just expected you to do well. There was one week, I never forgot this lesson. There was one week that I went, and I'm lucky. I've always been good at sight reading. I'm still really good at sight reading. But for mallets, it quickly got too hard for me to sight read. There was a week that I started my lesson and did snare drum, no problem, and did timpani, no problem. And I started trying to hack through whatever the George Hamilton Green lesson was for that week. And it was just a key that I hadn't practiced. After a while, he stopped me. He was like, "Did you practice?" And I just couldn't lie. And I was like, "No." And he goes, and he just put his sticks down, closed the book, and he said, "I'll see you next week." And I was like, he was like, "I'm not going to let you waste my time or your parents' money." It was such a good lesson to always be prepared. And I never didn't practice again. It was a great lesson. I'm super grateful for him. But at the moment, I wasn't.
Wow. Did you play in marching band in junior high?
I did. I had to. It was a requirement, not in junior high, but high school. I loved the Patriots. I loved the rudimental marching stuff that I did when I was a kid. I was super duper lucky. Fairfax County Public Schools, when I was there, they were the top 3 school systems in the country. It was Dallas, New York City, and Fairfax, Virginia, Northern Virginia. My high school, like the graduating class of my freshman year was like 1,500. My class was 732, and we were the smallest class they had ever had.
Wow.
So it was a huge school, and the arts programs in my school were phenomenal. In high school, there were 4 symphonic bands, 3 orchestras, 4 choruses, 2 guitar ensembles, and 3 jazz bands. And then there was the marching band. The only way they got the good players to be in the marching band was they made it, if you got into the top symphonic band, it was mandatory to be in the marching band. So it was like forced marching band, which made it less fun, although it was my only social life because I was a band nerd. It was tricky because I had learned traditional when I was a kid, and it was the first time I ever had to play match. I had to learn to play match, which was hard on me. Also, I was shorter by like 2 feet than everyone else on the snare drum line because I got onto the snare drums when I was a freshman, and everyone was tall, and they had to break a harness and put it back together so that it was small enough for me to wear. My head was almost level with the drum next to me.
Wow.
And I didn't know about earplugs. So it was not the best my first year or 2 in marching band. I grew to love it. I love the old guard, like rudimental drumming so much. That's my bread and butter. That's how I learned. Will Coxon was my first book. I love rudimental drumming. That's still what I do as my warm up before my show is play 3 cans and play Downfall of Paris. And, but that type of marching band, and it also wasn't cool marching band, like Drumline movie, kind of like, it wasn't like funky, cool stuff.
It's funny.
It was like,
that movie was kind of my life to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I mean, our marching band at Howard was good, but we weren't as good as a lot of other HBCUs.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to ask you about the fact that you started out on a pad, it was slanted, and snare drum in the pit that the last show I saw for you was SpongeBob. You still play traditional.
I still remember you saying aggressively traditional. I tell people that all the time.
We'd like to go back and learn how to play traditional. But man, we'll talk about that. That was so much fun to play. Did you play a lot of drum set in addition to orchestral and marching band?
Oh yeah. I learned pad and then started the private lessons with Mr. Evans. At some point, he let me start taking drum set lessons. And it was awesome. The first music I remember listening to and loving was the Beatles. The first thing I ever bought with my own money was Sgt. Pepper on cassette when I was 5 years old. My dad listened to classical music and jazz, and my mom listened to Motown, funk, and blues. And so I had like a really amazing, but what neither of them really listened to was rock. The only thing they both liked rock-wise was the Beatles and Cream. And that was what I first gravitated towards. I just loved listening to that and playing along with Ringo and that stuff. But then I also was listening to Fifth Dimension and Muddy Waters. I was also playing along to that stuff when I was a kid, which is I feel super lucky now that I got that was part of my first feel. So I was always playing drum set and taking drum set lessons. But it's so different when you're taking lessons and then actually playing the music,
Were you in any bands in high school?
Oh yeah. When I was in junior high, none of the high school drummers wanted to play the musical. So the junior high band director talked to the high school band director and said, one of my kids could do it. And they were like, he's in junior high, he can't do it. And he's like, no, he can do it. And he can read music. And so they were doing Music Man, actually. I remember that because I remember when we were reading through and I was like, why is there a Beatles song in the show? Because Till There Was You is in Music Man, but I knew it as a Beatles song first. But yeah, so I was playing that musical, and the guitarist and bassist who were playing that in high school were like, "Are you in band?" And I was like, "No, I'd love to be in band." So then I was like, I got to be in a band with these high school kids, and it was so cool. And we were called Strawberry Jam. So many high school bands. Somewhere there's a cassette that we recorded in his basement. But yeah, it was fun. You know, we played the Kinks and the Beatles and the Who. And I think at the time it was like, we played the Cult. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else contemporary that we played. Led Zeppelin. And, you know, it was mostly classic rock stuff that we were playing. I did that. And then I was in another band, the Brazilian Trained Surfers. The Battle of the Bands at my school was a really big deal. It used to be held in the gym, and they would rent a full stage, sound and lights, smoke machines. Every high school from the area would come to our Battle of the Bands. After I lived in New York for a couple of years, I met someone that was, oh, dude, Mike Aarons used to come to our high school's Battle of the Bands. That's where I know you from. I saw your band play at Robinson Ramsey.
Wow, that did grow up in the DC area.
Yeah, he's from Reston, and I'm from Fairfax. But it was a big deal. It was really exciting. And, you know, we got second one year with Brazilian Trained Surfers. We did
Wait, Brazilian trans surfers?
Brazilian Trained Surfers. No, trans wasn't a word back then. Trained Surfers. It was, and we did a Led Zeppelin medley. We did Metallica 1.
What?
That was the only time in my life I got a double basement pedal just so I could play with it. So I got it for that, and then I felt my foot getting weak, and I got rid of it. The pedal's still in my studio, but I haven't used it in 25 years, 30 years. I can't remember the other song. Anyway, it was cool. My senior year, I put together a jazz quartet, and we won with the jazz quartet, which was pretty cool. Every year, there was always one or two really great go-go bands because we were right near DC, and I can hear in my head the guy that was playing the bongos with one of the bands, and I play that like anytime I get a chance. I love that so much.
Do you ever try to play along to that stuff? It's so fun to play.
Yeah, it's so much fun. Those pockets are so bouncy. Yeah. When I think of playing, I think bouncy, and I totally hear that music in that. It's like, it's so bouncy and so much fun. It's like both fat and bouncy at the same time somehow.
Fat and bouncy. That's a good name for a band. So who are some of your drumming influences growing up?
Oh, man.
Other than your teachers?
Yeah, my teachers were really huge. Early on for me, I think the first music I really loved was jazz, but not like bebop. I came to that like 30 years later. I love swing, and I love early small band stuff. So it was really a lot, still to this day, probably Joe Jones and Buddy Rich and Shelly Manne are three of my biggest influences. I just think like Joe Jones and Shelly Manne, they're like melodic soloists in my mind, the way they play. I mean, I got my record collection right here, and the Shelly Manne section and the Joe Jones section are the biggest. Any record that I can find with them on, I buy just to hear what they do with anybody. Joe Jones and Shelly Manne and Buddy Rich. I still remember my dad. It was the only time I got to stay up late. My dad would come and get me out of bed whenever Buddy was on Johnny Carson and bring me into his room to watch. And then Gene Krupa, just for that feel. Something that he said, I remember reading an interview with him when I was a kid. He said, if he was playing and nobody was dancing, then he knew he wasn't playing. You know, I think of that all the time, and that influences me in a major way when I play still. But yeah, Gene Krupa was so those four like jazz drummers. And then when I got older, I think one of my hugest influences is Steve Smith and Dennis Chambers, those two guys. I think it's just probably an age thing. They hit when we were in high school and all that stuff was happening. Steve Smith was a bit of an accident. I had asked my parents for the early VHS videos. I asked them for a Steve Gadd video for Hanukkah, and they got me Steve Smith by accident. And I was like, well, I'll watch it. And then he became probably still my biggest influence of all time. The way he plays always, whenever I'm creating drum parts, I'm like, what would Steve Smith do? Every part he made is so perfect, in my opinion. So Steve Smith and Dennis Chambers. And Dennis was a huge influence, the hybrid thing that I do. You know, he and Alex Acuna, I saw them doing that in the 80s, you know, because Dennis would play kit and then have the timbales over here. And Alex would play kit and have congas over here. And that's why I put a djembe and bongos next to my drum set as soon as I started playing things, was because of those guys. You can blame them for all that stuff. You have to do that when you're just playing my parts. It was a big influence. I was playing with this group called Absolute Ensemble, which technically we still exist, but we haven't played in several years. It was a major influence for me. A lot of the cats that you saw that I played with are because of Absolute. There's a chamber orchestra that did crossover projects. When I first started playing with them, I subbed on one tour. There's a drummer and a percussionist. And on one tour, I subbed for the drummer for the first half. And then the second half, I subbed for the percussionist. The rec was all Frank Zappa stuff. So I had to learn the Ed Mann book for half of it. And I had to learn the Terry Bozzio book for half of it. That's still the hardest music I've ever played. And then the next time that we went out, neither of them could do it. So I just put the two setups together, except for the mallet parts, and played both at the same time. I remembered Alex and Dennis saying that's what he did with P-Funk, was that, they didn't have couldn't afford a percussionist sometimes. So he would just play the percussion parts while I was playing kit. And I was like, well, I guess I'll do what Dennis did and put it together like that. And so that was when that whole thing started for me. It just happened to be right after I moved to New York. It was really early on. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Did you, after high school, you went to college?
I did. I went to Cleveland Institute of Music. I had fallen in love. Thanks to Dr. Whaley, I had started to fall in love playing timpani. And then my senior year of high school, I auditioned for the National Symphony Youth Fellowship Program. I had been playing in the American Youth Philharmonic since junior high, and that started my love for classical music. And I was just really, really lucky. There was just so many opportunities around me. My dad forced me to go to the audition, and I cried the whole way there. But I got in, and the conductor and artistic director was a violinist in the National Symphony. It was Luis Haza, Cuban, amazing musician, and kind of like Mr. Evans, he was just like full of love, optimism, and positivity. He put together this youth orchestra. So many of the people I was in youth orchestra with are principals in major orchestras all through the States and the world. And actually a lot of them were from high school. My high school was really rich in talent. It was just a public high school. But so I was playing in that orchestra. I was really loving classical music a lot. And then my senior year, I got into this youth fellowship program. So as part of being in that program, you got to go once a week. I got to skip school once a week and go watch the National Symphony rehearse on Thursday mornings. And then I got private lessons with the timpanist in the National Symphony, who was Fred Begun, who had studied with, Saul Goodman, who Dr. Whaley had also studied with Saul Goodman. And so I was really lucky. I had really amazing teachers. Freddie was real old school. I have nothing but love for that guy. He was so beautiful. And he's also an old Jewish guy. I felt like he was my grandpa, and he was always calling me Bubby. And he had a bowl of chocolate chips next to the timpani during the lessons. And he's like, whenever you need a little energy, you just pop a few chocolate chips and you're ready to go. But he was all about, if you don't love it, then you're not playing it right. Really great lessons about where it's coming from, the heart. And one of the things that Dr. Whaley told me, and I was also playing when I was in high school with George Mason University Orchestra, because now they have a really great music program, but back then they did not have a very big one. I auditioned and started playing with them. When I was in 9th grade, they didn't have anyone to play their musical. Since I had started playing with the orchestra, they asked if I'd be interested. The first one I did with them was Kiss Me Kate. And that also, I had to combine the percussion and a drum set book. So I put the glockenspiel, like Bill Miller does. I put the glockenspiel on top of the bass drum and had the percussion next to me, and then just used the floor tom and physically copied and cut and pasted a book together to play that part. I was playing that orchestra there. One of the other people in that section was this guy named Aubrey Adams. He was like, if you want to pursue a career in music, you should go to a conservatory. I didn't know if I wanted to play drum set or classical. Part of me wanted to play, sessions and be in a jazz club every night till 4 a.m. And part of me wanted like an orchestra job with a townhouse in Georgetown and like just live a life like that. I was really split. Aubrey said, if you want to go the classical route, you should go to a conservatory. You can always practice drum set on the side and keep up your chops. I took that advice and auditioned for conservatories, and I ended up going to Cleveland Institute of Music. Part of the draw there was the dean at the time was a jazz pianist. And you know who Andy Kubashevsky was, the drummer for Nine Inch Nails and Trent Reznor, and he's from Cleveland. And he had gone to Cleveland Institute of Music for classical, but then started doing sessions and got too busy. His name is Marshall Griffiths. He was his drummer for all of his jazz work. And Andy had just gotten busy and was not available anymore. So the dean called me up and said, if you come here, I'll use you for my jazz trio. I was like, all right, that's great. So that led me to go to Cleveland. The very first day of school, I was moving my drum set in to like the corner of one of the student, and there was like a grad student there practicing four game bass, 1,000 times on the xylophone. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, Mr. Yatra said I could set my drums up here." And he looked at me, he goes, "This isn't Berkeley." And then put his headphones back on and I almost burst into tears. I was like, "I chose the wrong school." But it ended up being great because my teachers supported it, even though the peers didn't. It worked out because I was the only one there that could play drum set. Any drum set gig was mine that came through the school. For the first 2 years I was there, nobody else even played drum set. It always blew my mind that somebody was like, I love classical music and wanted to play it, but I found my way there through Neil Peart and Stuart Copeland, Ringo and Keith Moon. Someone was like, "I love that triangle part. I'm going to be a percussionist." That's always what I joke, but I'm like, why did you want to be a percussionist without playing drums? It's so weird to me. But whatever works for people. But I felt that it really helped because since I approached classical percussion like a drummer about groove and feel and sound and pocket, I think it added a lot to what I was doing. I'm really grateful for the split background, even if it did cause some emotional trauma for a few.
I think that makes a big difference, coming from a different perspective. You definitely have a certain feel that separates you from people that just focus specifically on one thing. It helps you get a lot more work that way, I believe. After college, you went to grad school?
I did, yeah. Cleveland School of Music was amazing. I chose Cleveland because I heard Cloyd Duff play at a PASIC convention when I was a junior in high school, and I had never heard a sound like that. I mean, it was the most beautiful tone and sound I'd ever heard. And then because I was studying with Garwood Whaley, I kept taking drum set lessons from Sam Evans my whole life, but it just became just drum set. I started taking legit percussion from Dr. Whaley and then timpani from Fred Begun. So I had 3 lessons my senior year a week. When I heard Cloyd Duff play, it totally changed my life. I was like, I want to learn to make that sound. And at the time, everybody winning timpani jobs in any orchestra had gone to Cleveland Institute. And so I was like, that's where I want to go to school. And so I went to school there so I could learn that Cleveland sound. And I figured I'll always have the other sound in my hand. I can make that sound if I want to. I went to Cleveland, and it was really interesting because it was really closed-minded and cutthroat competitively. It was not a healthy environment. It was about showing that you were practicing the most hours and it did not come from the teachers. Like the teachers are Paul Yanchich, who's still there, who's the timpanist in the Cleveland Orchestra, and Richard Weiner, who sadly passed away this past year. But those guys were not about that. They would tell me, "Damien, you don't need to practice so much. You're doing well. Don't worry about it." And Mr. Weiner would always tell me, "Whatever you do, don't lose your swing. You have swing. Don't lose that. I stopped playing drums and I lost my swing. Don't lose your swing." They were not about spending 15 hours a day, but there was so much peer pressure. Everybody in the department was like, if you're awake and not in the practice room, you're wasting your time. I was not a strong enough person to resist that. And so that seeped in, and I ended up developing really debilitating hand issues. When I was there, 3 people had carpal tunnel surgery. Now, a lot of people had hand issues and back issues, and it kind of broke me a little bit mentally. I knew all I have to do is win a job. My life is about winning a timpani job. I lost track of everything else, even though I had been paying my rent the whole time playing jazz gigs. I learned so much. I'm so lucky to play those gigs with those guys. And Cleveland had a great jazz scene. I'm sure they still do. I got to see so many great players so close up when I was there. But yeah, I really lost track of things. It became less about being a great musician and learning to be a better artist and more about being perfect, which I think probably all musicians go through a little bit of that. Being perfect was not, sometimes that works for people. It did not work for me. Really shut me down and mentally and physically too. My senior year, Tim Adams came through. Tim Adams had gone to school there, and he was timpanist in the Pittsburgh Symphony, which incidentally was my first audition. I did really well. And then he ended up winning the job. He's about 15 years older. He came to do a master class, and he said 2 things that stuck with me. He said, "I always knew I had to get an orchestra job to support my drum set habit." He couched it like a drug thing, but that resonated strongly with me. I was like, that's what I need, an orchestra job so I can play drums all the time. So I became obsessed. I didn't get it in the good way that he meant it. I became obsessed with I have to get an orchestra job so I can play drums, which doesn't make any sense. But I was a kid. The other thing was I was playing Finlandia symphony parts, great symphony part. I was worrying so much about using proper technique, which was a really big Cleveland thing, was like technique. And at one point he stopped me and he goes, "Damien," he goes, "I don't think you can make a bad sound. Just hit the drum. Stop worrying about it." That was so key because it's like that Malcolm Gladwell thing. Like I had put in my 50,000 hours of technique and I wasn't going to make an ugly sound unless I wanted to make an ugly sound. Him just giving me permission was huge. When I was graduating and I knew I wanted to go to grad school, I was like, I need to study with that guy. I made a pit stop on the way and I went to Juilliard first, which was a mistake. It was really interesting. When I was there, it was like the opposite of Cleveland. At Cleveland, you were never good enough and never practicing enough hours. At Juilliard, there was a real vibe like, this is Juilliard, you've arrived. It kind of came from not the percussion faculty, but I remember theory teachers and the general vibe of the place. It was like, this is Juilliard. You've arrived. You've made it. And I was like, I'm not anywhere. I'm a kid and I need to get a job. I just felt like the people of my peers were great people and great players. And, like Matthew Strauss, who's in Houston Symphony, was amazing. And Pablo Riepi, who just took over at Oberlin College, really great people. But I wasn't getting enough challenge from a lot of the peers. I felt like everything I did, my teachers were like, that sounds great. And I was like, doesn't sound good enough because I'm still in school. So make me better kind of a thing, And I was just like, had real blinders on and I was practicing like 15 hours a day. And I like developed a situation where I couldn't open my hand and couldn't move my arm, really over practice. And so Tim came through again, just like those things that happened with the Pittsburgh Symphony. He came and listened to me play and he was like, call this woman and tell her that you're coming to Carnegie Mellon on a full scholarship. Ask her to give me a call. He plucked me out of a real depth and I still couldn't play. And what Tim did, so freaking grateful. Like he was like old school mentor. So I couldn't play physically yet. So my lessons were like, he'd call me like 7:30 in the morning. And you're like, yo, D, come pick me up. And I'd be like, what? He'd be like, get dressed and pick me up. And I would go pick him up at his house and we'd drive to the hall and he'd work on his drums and I'd sit with him and watch him work on the timpani. And then I'd sit in the hall during rehearsal. We'd go to lunch afterwards. He'd be like, drop me off at home and go practice. I would drop him off at home and then come back and then give rehearsals or whatever. And then he'd be like, okay, come get me after the concert. And I'd pick him up. We'd go hear salsa bands. And he'd be like, you see that girl over there? Go say hi to her. You get an F for your lesson this week. And I was like super introverted. I was like, I can't talk to her. He knew what motivated me. He knew I didn't want to get a bad grade, but I couldn't talk to a girl. So he was like this old school full body mentor, like heart, soul, mind, hands, everything. And then gradually I was allowed to start playing again. I was seeing a bunch of doctors and stuff. I had focal dystonia. I had to relearn how to play. And just he was amazing. He got me back through doing that. I was started to take auditions again and I would always get to the finals. I was in Pittsburgh and I was playing with the klezmer band and I would play with the band that he played with, the marching thing, with just wearing a snare, and we'd play the Pittsburgh Pirate Pet Band, we'd march around the stadium playing. And then I would play with this pop singer and sub with an orchestra. And I was like, this made me happy. Just doing the orchestra stuff, I was so unhappy. And he's like, okay, so then let's do that. It was a thing of just giving permission to be like, it's okay. It was real hard. I felt like I was failing my parents if I didn't get an orchestra job. They were Jewish parents that didn't push me to be a doctor. They pushed me to be an artist. But it worked out. My sister's an artist too. She's an actress. I felt like I was failing them if I didn't get that. And once Tim gave me permission, he's like, if that's not what you want to do, then let's do this. And I was like, oh, okay. And so then my lessons became playing along with Parliament records and Ohio Players records and going to hear bands and all that kind of stuff. And it was so amazing. And then I moved to New York. It worked out.
But you were in grad school. You finished grad school in Cleveland?
So Pittsburgh. I went to
Carnegie Mellon.
So I went Cleveland, Juilliard, and then Carnegie Mellon.
So you went to Juilliard to start out grad school and you're like, no, this is not work.
Yeah, it just wasn't the place for me. I just wasn't ready. I wasn't, I was glad I went to school in Cleveland because there were really no distractions there. I just practiced and went to hear the Cleveland Orchestra on Saturday nights and spent time with my friends and my girlfriend. In New York, there's nothing but distractions. And I just wanted to practice. I was not in a good headspace. So when Tim gave me that lifeline, I followed him to Pittsburgh. It was the best thing that could have happened to me.
What was your emphasis at Carnegie Mellon?
I was a performance major there as well. I got a master's in performance music. I was really a timpani major in both undergrad and grad school. I was a timpani major. I was studying to be really focused on timpani. I could play everything else, but I never got musical highs playing orchestral percussion. My first musical high was playing timpani for Romeo and Juliet, Overture Fantasy, Tchaikovsky when I was at Interlochen. my junior year of high school. And I just remember like playing that role at the end and like having like a full flush over my body and starting to have emotional overload, just playing this huge timpani role surrounded by the sound of this orchestra. That was my first musical high. And I was like, oh, wow. And I remember telling my dad about it. And my dad was like, you can be a professional musician. That's something that's a job that you can do. And I was like, oh, wow. Because I also wanted to be like a graphic designer or an English teacher or maybe some sort of sociologist, anthropologist person. And I was a big nerd and a good student. Then I found this passion.
You wound up moving to New York City after grad school.
Yeah.
What year was that?
Summer
99. And your first job, did you go right into something professionally? Did you have a gig lined up?
No. So my friend from undergrad and roommate at Juilliard is this composer named John Mackey, who I'm still really good friends with. I saw him last month when I was in San Francisco. He had stayed at Juilliard and was living in New York and working at the Lincoln Center archives. When I was thinking about maybe moving to New York, he had written some music for a string quartet, clarinet, piano, and drums for the Parsons Dance Company. He had written all this percussion music with me in mind. So I came to New York to do this, and we rehearsed for 2 weeks and played at the Joyce. While I was here, I reconnected with my friend Tom Kitt, who I had met at Interlochen. We were in the same cabin at Interlochen the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. And he had been trying to get me to move to New York for years. We became real fast friends at Interlochen. Like the second day or third day we were there, we found a cabin that had a piano and a drum set, climbed in through the window, and spent our whole summer in that cabin just playing music together. While I was here to do that gig with the dance company for John, at nighttime, we were rehearsing with Tom and a bass player and guitarist, rehearsing songs and doing things. He had been sending me cassette tapes for years of songs he was writing. Like, what do you think about this? And I would put drum parts to it and send it back. I've been next to normal. I have the cassette somewhere in a shoebox from 1997 when he wrote that song and mailed it to me and was like, what do you think about this? What do you think about the bridge? We've been working on these songs for a long time. I did this gig and I was playing for these dancers. And at the end of that gig, a couple of the dancers were like, do you play dance classes? I was like, of course I play dance classes. I had no idea what that meant at all. I didn't even play hand drums at that time. And they were like, oh, great. In a couple of weeks, I'm teaching this workshop. And the other guy was like, well, I'm teaching a workshop in the afternoon the same week. And they were like, you should do it. And so I was like, absolutely. I talked to my sister and I was like, can I come stay with you? She was already living here at that point. I went back to Pittsburgh. I bought a djembe and I checked out some videos of the Royal Ballet of New Guinea, which are all djembefalos, and like slow motioned it and figured out how to play djembe. And then came back and started playing for those 2 weeks, played dance classes. And we set up to do a gig at Arlene's Grocery since I was going to be in town with Tom Kitt. During the day, I was playing dance classes, playing for a bunch of dance tricks. In the evening, rehearsing with the band. And then we did a gig and all the dancers came to the gig and the dance company that I'd played for came. And I was like, I'm moving to New York right now. John was like, there's an opening with jazz at Lincoln Center because they're going to be moving out. He's like, it's hush hush, but they're buying the Coliseum and they're going to open a new jazz at Lincoln Center complex. They need to extract their music from the Lincoln Center archives to make their own music library. I was like, well, I know about jazz. I had taken jazz history at all three schools I went to. I always loved jazz, but I am a total Luddite with technology. So I went to the interview and I impressed enough with my knowledge of the music that they were like, okay, you can do it. So when I moved here, my job was to be the archivist to create the library, which was thrilling because I was holding Duke Ellington's manuscripts in my hand, looking at his notation. It was mind blowing. It's still mind blowing to this day when I think about it. But that was amazing. It didn't lead to any playing gigs, but at the time, like Winton heard me talking to my boss and was like, I need a guide like that that's organized to help me with this project I'm doing. I ended up having the key to Winton's apartment and was helping him when he was writing Blood on the Floor with James Oliverio for the first collaboration between the New York Phil and Center Jazz Orchestra. Oliverio, I didn't know him personally, but he had written my teacher a timpani concerto. So I was like, oh, I've studied your timpani concerto. And he's like, wait, you know about real music and stuff. And so then I ended up helping with the percussion parts for that piece of music, like hanging out when. So it didn't lead to any playing, but it led to some really incredible experiences and exposure. So I had this job working at Lincoln Center and then working for James Oliverio. And that was a really cool year where I didn't have a lot of playing, but that was a really cool transition into New York for me.
Did you still have a goal of becoming a professional timpanist?
I had let go when I was still at Carnegie Mellon, I had taken the audition for a principal timpani job at the Columbus Symphony, and it had narrowed it down to 3 people. They decided to each have us back for 3 months to play with the orchestra to see who they liked best. I had a great run there. One thing that happened was while I was there, I remember my first day in, I had studied all the scores. We were doing Prokofiev 5 and Marriage Figaro Overture and stuff. And I'd studied all the scores, and I got there early to work on the timpani and clear the head so everything would be in tune. And I had the score next to me on a stand and was all ready to go. Everybody walked in 2 minutes before downbeat and just whipped out their horn and their violin, And then we were in the middle of a second to last bar of the symphony when the clock ticked. People would put their instruments down before the last chord, and it was break. I was like, come on, what's wrong with you people? After 3 months, I was looking at the clock and being like, it's break. I noticed that I do not want music to be a job. If music is a job, I'm going to go make a lot more money and do something else. I still wanted it. I wasn't ready to walk away. The end of my section came, the last person did it, and it was time to find out who got the thing. And I got this phone call from the personnel director of the orchestra, and he was like, hey, and they called at 7:30 in the morning on a Tuesday or something. I was still living in Pittsburgh at the time. And he was like, hi, I just wanted to let you know, we really appreciate it. We decided to go in another direction. And I was devastated because all the people in the orchestra to whom I had spoken were like, you got the job. Everybody loves you. The conductor adores you. You got the job. I was packing my stuff up to move to Columbus. 2 months later, I got a phone call from the principal percussionist, who's a great guy. He asked he was like, I'm so sorry what happened. We need an extra for a summer pops concert. Do you want to come play? And I was like, I really don't. What happened? That's such a bad taste in my mouth. And he was like, well, you know what happened, right? He said that when they went to vote, there's 12 orchestra members on the panel and the conductor, and 11 of them voted for me. And one person voted for someone else who was a friend he had gone to school with. He was the concertmaster. And apparently everyone was like, well, Damien won the job. This is the story that I was told. And apparently this violinist lobbied the conductor for a couple of weeks and said, I was too green, too inexperienced. I wouldn't be able to handle the pressures, and got the conductor to overturn it and hire the other guy. What the guy told me about a year later, the guy called me again just to see how I was doing. At that point, I had moved to New York and I was really happy with the decision. But that was a real turning point for me. My thing was, I don't like schmoozing and I don't like being fake. And so I felt like in order to be successful in almost all the rest of the parts of music, you had to be willing to go out and do the schmooze and tell people how great they are and not be yourself. And in rehearsal, classical music is the one meritocracy. You're behind a screen, you audition, blah, blah, blah. When I heard that story, I was just like, it's not a meritocracy. So if it's not a meritocracy, I want to go play drums in New York City. And that's what got me to move. And so I was grateful for it, but I had come around to being like, I don't want to be in that world. I don't want to be in a world that music is a job. I don't want to be in a world where they look down on you because you play drum set on the side. I don't want to be in a world where, they don't understand that Shostakovich has a pocket and a groove. I remember going to hear the Cleveland Orchestra and they were doing Shostakovich 10, which is the end of that is a freaking heavy metal mosh band. It's amazing. It's so cool. And I remember someone behind me going, excuse me, young man, could you please sit still? I'm trying to listen to the music. And I was like, do you know that classical music is based on dance forms? You're supposed to move to this music, And all these little combined things that happened around the same time just said, I was like, you're in the wrong place. And so I had let go of wanting to be a timpanist and just wanted to play all music again. And that, combined with that dance performance gig, sent me to New York.
So having a Broadway show is very similar. It's a job, but it's a job that I particularly love. I'm sure you do as well. How do you reconcile the fact that, you said you didn't want you didn't want a job, but now doing shows, it's kind of like having a job. How do you see it make sense out of that?
That's actually a really great question. I've been really fortunate. As a drummer, you're part of a show from the creation. You're usually there on that first day of the first rehearsal, the very first reading. I'm not totally sure what your experience is, but mine has been that I've gotten to create the drum parts for the shows that I've played. With the exception of one show, I've gotten to write all the books for all the shows I've played. And so I feel a sense of ownership of them. And I also have always left space. Now, this is different from subbing because subbing is a real different gig. And we talk about that separately. But when I'm playing the show that's my show, I feel like I'm still getting to express myself within, I don't feel confined, within the context of what it's trying to say and communicate to the audience. One of the things that I thought was so great about classical music, and it wasn't a job for me, was that even though you were playing written timpani parts, I would go to the library and get books on the composer and the pieces, if there were any, and books and look up like what was happening socially and historically at the time the pieces were written. And I would try to find out as much about the piece as I could. It would find its way into my version of how I played the music. I feel like when you play a show, you're part of the storytelling. And if you're just playing your part, then you probably shouldn't be doing that gig, in my opinion. I feel like we are there when I play with any singer in a band. I am there to support what they're trying to do. When I'm playing in a show, my job is to support the storytelling, the ambience, the atmosphere, the emotion, or if it's a dance break, to support the dancers, the energy or the buoyancy of the moment. So I never feel like I'm just playing a part, for one thing. You know, this varies from pit to pit. There are some people that are just doing a job, showing up and playing their notes. What you're there for me, it's the interaction between you and the other musicians. It's hard to interact with the cast. You hope they're listening to you, but you don't really know. But like, you at least can like feel that bass player is listening to you. And when you shift, he's shifting with you a little bit. And when you hear the guitarist laying into something a little different, you bring that hi-hat up a little different that day. And that's thrilling every time for me. I never get tired of that experience. It's so exciting. It's that connection. It's the thing that I miss so much about this whole period. Was I grateful for the 6 or 7 home recording records I got to do for people? I was, but it didn't feel like I was playing music. It felt like I was in a room by myself, almost like practicing, learning something, because you were just doing it by yourself. But it's that interaction with the people you're working with that's so exciting. Every night is different, even if what's on the page is the same. I rarely play the part the same exact way every night. Even the parts that I do, you feel it differently every night because you had a different day. You read something that made you happy or talked to a relative that made you feel sad. And so you play it differently that night. I never feel like I'm going to work. One of the things that I always say when I give advice to people that are doing their first show, if they ask, I always say, if you don't feel like going to work that night, sub out, because somebody else does feel like it. And you shouldn't be there if you don't want to be there, because your heart isn't in it and someone else needs the money and wants to play. If I don't feel like playing that night, I make a phone call. So I don't really have that experience of it feeling like a job because I don't let it happen.
What was the first show that you did in New York City as a drummer, on Broadway or off Broadway?
Well, actually, the first show I did was a limited run Mario Cantone's one-man show, Laugh For, Tom Kitt in bold print. The Tom Kitt band was Mario's backup band. We did a lot of backup bands for comedians in the early 2000s.
Wasn't Mike Aarons in that band too?
Mike played and Dan Grenis was the bass player. Really,
man, wow,
great bass player. He's based in Vegas now, but I miss him. Such a good player. We were the band, and that was the first show that we did. It was really fun. But my first Broadway show was the original Color Purple, which I got.
That's where I met you, I think.
Yeah, that's where we met. And you subbing for Buddy.
Yes.
Yeah. That was my first Broadway show. That was amazing. And that was a show I got because I played dance classes, and I had played for a workshop that Donald Byrd did at Steps. And Donald said, I just got asked to do a workshop for this possible Broadway show. Would you be, he's like, I want to have a drummer. He's like, I'm just paying you out of my pocket, so it's not going to be that much, but would you want to come do it? And I was like, of course. Get a chance to work with Donald Byrd. Amazing. And that led to getting that gig ultimately, because we ended up creating this 18-minute African ballet during that workshop, which stayed in the show. And I had written this giant African percussion score for it. And he ended up saying, I have to bring my percussionist with me to do this. So I ended up getting the gig, which is really fortunate.
Did you write a lot of the parts for that show?
I wrote the whole percussion score. That was my first show. So I didn't know the way things worked yet. So I wrote all the parts for that. And then we got into the first orchestra rehearsal, and I was handed some percussion parts, which were mostly tacit sheets with the occasional timpani roll and triangle roll. Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously Jonathan Tunick is a genius master orchestrator, but we had created this whole show outside of what he had been given in the rehearsal room. I had 3 huge African drums, congas, bongos, tambourines, shakers, a metal chain that I had gotten from like a scrapyard, like all this stuff. And then I got this.
You dropped it on the floor, right?
I got a wooden board, dropped it on the board, sandpaper blocks, all this stuff. And I was handed these parts that were triangle rolls and timpani rolls. I remember looking at Kevin Stites and being like, what should I do? And he's like, play what you did. The composers are going to hear what you did in the room. The very first orchestra rehearsal started and I started playing the backbeat on the tambourine. Tunick stopped and he goes, what the hell is the percussionist doing? I was like, I'm just playing my part. I didn't know who Jonathan Tunick was and I should have handled it differently. But I was like, I'm just playing my part. He's like, you don't have a part there. What's he doing? Thankfully, Kevin Stites stood up and was like, well, this is what he created in the room with the composers. But the composers also didn't really have experience doing Broadway either. So they sort of didn't know to assert themselves and be like, we want to hear what he's doing, you know? And it was super awkward for a little while. But eventually the composers said, we tried it once without me playing any of my parts. And they were like, we would like to hear Damien do what he did. And so Tunick didn't ever like it. He never once was like, nice job, or I like what you're doing, or I totally understand. I ended up playing all the parts that I had written that show. And it was pretty exciting.
Speaking of that, did you ever in future shows come up with your own drum parts or percussion parts and get orchestrating credits?
It's something that happens in the industry. It's something that we're always talking about behind the scenes, and it's really tricky. I have gotten, Tom gave me credits for writing, it said like additional drum arrangements, but I had written most of Next to Normal before the show even happened. And that was working with Michael Starobin, who is an absolute genius. He's brilliant at writing rhythm section parts, but it was tricky because I think he came to the project not knowing that I had been working on that show for a decade and that Tom and I had Tom wrote the songs. I'm not claiming any credit for writing songs, but I had come up with all the drum parts and the feels independently because a lot of them were Tom Kit Band songs, and the ones that weren't, we had got together and flushed the songs out in my studio in the music building. That show, I came to that show fully formed by the time Starobin came in. And then Starobin added this gorgeous mallet writing on top of the stuff I had written for drum set, hand drums, and timpani. It's a beautiful book, but it ended up being a super collaborative book with Starobin. It was great. The thing that was tricky was that I had also written all the drum parts to High Fidelity. That was a situation where when the great Alex Lacamoire was brought in to orchestrate it, he came to the first rehearsal and Tom hadn't told him, oh, Damien already has the drum parts written. And so Alex was great about it, but it kept putting me in awkward positions. I've had that happen more times than I wish it had it. You know, in Addams Family, I think I got a thank you in the giant paragraph of we would also like to thank things. But Larry Hochman is amazing. August is the best. And August Erickson, he did the dance arrangements, took care of me on that one in a really beautiful way. It just really depended on the person. It's been a little frustrating as it can be, but it is what it is. I just want to keep working and I like getting to create it. And if you don't get the credit, you don't get the credit, but you get to play a part that is satisfying to play. There's one show that I played where I didn't get to write the parts. They weren't idiomatic. They didn't always make sense. And they were a little stilted to play. Thankfully, that show barely lasted and it didn't make a difference, but that wasn't as much fun. I've been really lucky. If Then was great. Starobin wrote a drum book and then Tom allowed me to flush it out in a way that felt organic. SpongeBob, similar. SpongeBob was a bunch of pop tunes that Tom wrote sketches for. And he's like, I wrote sketches for it. He's like, do what you want. And if there's something else, I'll let you know. If you're doing something that I don't want, I'll let you know. And if there's something specific, I'll let you know.
The first show you did was Color Purple. And then after Color Purple, what was the next one that came your way?
High Fidelity.
I think I saw that once.
Oh, it wasn't. The producers didn't advertise for it. People in the next theater over didn't know that we were opening. There was no advertising for it. It was a really fun show. It also was a victim of one of the worst reviews ever written by Brantley that had absolutely nothing to do with the show. It was a last straw moment for Brantley in terms of movie adaptations, which now is almost every single musical, right? At that point, it was a tipping point for Brantley. And it was really a tirade against musicals based on pre-existing properties. The review said almost nothing about our show, but it was scathing at the same time. It was really unfortunate, but it was great. The songs that Tom wrote for that show pop in my head all the time because they were so catchy. And Amanda Green's lyrics were so funny. Just really great. Huh.
So after High Fidelity, what was after that?
Man, chronologically speaking, I think the next thing was maybe the next thing after High Fidelity was off-Broadway show called Great American Trailer Park Musical, which was
yeah, I heard about that too.
Guitarist Dave that you played, Dave Matos was in that band.
Yes, Matt too, right? Wasn't Matt? Nah, I got it.
Inkley?
No, Matt Gallagher.
No, Matt wasn't on that. Matt was on High Fidelity. Gallagher was on High Fidelity.
Okay, that's probably confusing.
Oh, Gallagher, man. He was so awesome.
Dave
so awesome.
Matos, man.
Dave Matos. Yeah. That was a crazy fun band, a crazy fun show. And then maybe was the next thing Addams Family? I'm not sure. That was a really amazing, that was a great experience. That was great and bad and great and bad, up and down. Happy, sad, like the show said. There were some great things about it. Getting to work with Andrew Lippa. It was the first show I did with Mary Mitchell, which was amazing. And Andrew was such a great composer and great singer. Having him in the room was so exciting. It's like having Tom in the room. Just getting to work with these great composers like Tom Kitt and Andrew Lippa was so lucky. And then, before Addams Family was Next to Normal. Next to Normal was before Addams Family because I left Next to Normal to do Addams Family. Yeah, Next to Normal and that was like my first big hit that I got to play.
How long did that last and why did you leave?
So we had done, I had worked on that show for like 10 years because it was Tom's. And I had done when you play like 2 or 3 songs from a show on a concert with other shows, I had been doing it since back then, before we had even done a workshop and a reading. We did a nymph run that I couldn't do because I was in lock-in for Culprit or something. Then we did the off-Broadway at Second Stage. Then we did the DC at Arena Stages where Tom and Brian totally rewrote the show and then opened on Broadway. That show was so close to me emotionally, and the show itself was so emotional. Playing that show, you would hear people heaving and sobbing and breaking down. It was a really powerful piece of art that Brian and Tom created. And it actually, we were on stage, and like I said before, if I'm not in it, if I'm not supporting and connecting and communicating, playing, then it's not worthwhile to me. But that was a show that I needed to find a way to separate, and I couldn't. And I was going through the emotional ringer every single night, and it was a lot. And after, I got married during it, and just a lot of stuff was happening. After a year of it, I just needed to step away from it. It was too much to play every night. It was so thrilling because that book, I've been lucky to write all my books, but that book is like really me in a drum book. Like all the stuff that I do in terms of feels and pockets and the djembe drum set thing, I was too close to it. When I had this chance to step to this comedy show that I had been working on also for 5 or 6 years, it felt like the right time to step aside and let someone else sit in the chair. I got Shannon, who's so great, and Shannon got to play. It was the right move for me to step away and do something else. That's why I left. It was because the show was so good that I had to step away.
Then you went to Addams Family.
That show was really fun, and I got to play another fun hybrid book that I had written. And, I really liked, it was sort of like a step on the way to where I would eventually get SpongeBob. It was nice to play a show that made people laugh, that people would come to Next Normal, and I'd see them afterwards, and they would just look like they'd been crying for an hour. They would say, I just need to walk around for a little before I can talk. They would,
Wow.
they'd be hit, which felt great, but also was it was nice to play Addams Family and come out and just be like, that was so much fun. I loved it. To just have a different kind of reaction.
You did If Then after Addams.
Yeah. If Then, that was a weird show because it was a Tom show that the producers did not give him the budget to bring drums in during rehearsals. I think that show also was like a victim of its excellence in a way. It was Tom and Brian and Michael, who had just done Next to Normal, was their last show, a gigantic hit. It was the first time that Adina and Anthony had been together since Rent. it had LaChance, which was like her first big show since Color Purple. It had Jen Colella, it had Jerry Dixon. It was an embarrassment of riches in this show. And Starobin was orchestrating again. So it was, I think the expectations were so gigantic that there's no way it could have lived. How do you live up to Next to Normal and Rent? Like with the addition of Jerry Dixon and LaChance and Jen Colella. It's just crazy. And I think it was, for me, it was such a different experience because it was the first time I had done a show with Tom where I hadn't been in the room. So the first time I got to see the show, we were like, was rehearsals for when rehearsals started in Out of Town in DC. And I was like, what's happening? It was so weird to be playing songs that I didn't know when they were already happening. And I didn't know the story. And I was trying to play catch up. The music was great because it was Tom Kitt and the lyrics were super brilliant and funny because they were Brian Yorkie's. The piece was great. I think the trouble with that show was just that they didn't figure out exactly how to tell the story. And also not all audiences are that smart. You really had to pay attention. You really couldn't passively consume that show. You had to pay attention the whole time. And not everybody wants to think when they go to a musical. I think people go to a play with a different expectation than a musical sometimes. And so I think it suffered from bloated expectations. But I think it was a great piece and the music is great. And anytime I get to play a song from there, I'm always like, oh my gosh, this is such a great song. It did well. And I love what Adina did, but Adina can be polarizing. Some people don't like her voice. Some people do. And it is what it is. But I loved that experience. I thought it was great. And I also got to meet some great people like Tamika Lawrence, who then I formed a band with and played with her for a while, and freaking Force of Nature. And the first time I got to work with Pearl Sun and a whole bunch of great people that I met on that show. That's the fun thing about doing shows is all the people you meet and then get to work with afterwards. So
speaking of great people, tell me about the Kristen Chenoweth show.
Oh man.
To Broadway.
I'm a little speechless when it comes to Kristen. I just think that she is a timeless classic talent that would have been Barbra Streisand if she was born then. Like she can sing. She can legitimately, people say that about everybody, but she can legitimately sing anything. She is the only person I've ever met that is nicer than her public persona and more talented than her public persona. Like behind the scenes, she's even more Kristen than she is in front of the scenes. Like she's an amazing boss. She's so much fun to work with. She's an incredible musician and she's just really exciting. And in terms of like living your dream, like playing with her is as close to like being successful in quotes as I have with anything that I've done. Like when I was in Pittsburgh and I was studying with Tim, Tony Bennett came through and they were playing with the orchestra and he brought his own trio with him. He brought piano, bass, and drums like you've done like plenty of times. And so Clayton Cameron was playing drums. And after Tim was, I heard about it and I was like, oh my gosh, Clayton's playing with you guys this week. And he goes, hey, want to come to rehearsal? And I was like, of course. And Tim is awesome. He like brought me to rehearsal and I got to sit and watch Clayton warm up and do the rehearsal with the orchestra. And he goes, you want to get lunch with him? And I was like, you can't just talk to someone like Clayton Cameron. You know how it is when you're on the side, you don't think about it. And like, you can't just do that. And he's just a musician like anyone else. He's in a town where he probably doesn't know anybody. He probably doesn't have anything to do. And so I was like with Tim and we walked up and he's like, this is my student Damien, and meet him. And he said, do you want to have lunch? And he was like, sure. So we like went and had lunch and then we're having lunch. And then he's like telling us about this new book he's working on. This is before his Brushes book came out. And he's like, do you want to check it out? He's like, I'd love to see what you guys think about some of the notation I'm using. And like, we went back to his hotel room and like, he showed us the stuff on one of those Ed Fig pen brush pads. And he like had like the handwritten stuff on the pictures and he was flipping the pages. And I was like, just sitting there, just like a little kid, like watching a movie of himself being like, this is the life, man. You play with this person and you go and you play with orchestras and you're in different towns every day. And I was like, this is my dream. And that's what I get to do with Kristen. Like on Friday night, we're flying to Utah and we're playing with the Utah Symphony and we have rehearsal in the morning with orchestra and then we have the concert in the evening and then I'll fly back on Sunday. But those gigs with Kristen are everything because it's like, I'm not playing in orchestras anymore. I'm not a timpanist, but I still get to play with orchestras all the time. And I get to do it from my place of confidence and comfort. And when you're a timpanist, you're driving the orchestra. You're the drummer of the orchestra. But when you're actually the drummer in the orchestra, you're really the drummer in the orchestra. And so we play with the freaking Chicago Symphony and the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I'm in the front playing this amazing rep with the best singer in the world and getting to play with these orchestras that I always dreamt of playing with. And for me, it's the absolute, I get so emotional talking about it, but every single time I pinch myself and say, how lucky, because it's so great. And I'm using my technique and my chops to play cleanly and with dynamics, but I'm also thinking like a drummer and I'm driving a full orchestra and a string section. And every time without fail, our amazing production manager, Matt, he sets things up in the morning. So I get there for the orchestra rehearsal and the string players are coming in and I'm sitting in between, in front of / in between, depending upon the size of the orchestra, the cellos and the violas. And so immediately you just get all these looks and people putting in earplugs while they stare at you and all this thing, the usual thing. And then by the first orchestra break, everyone's taking the earplugs out and everyone's smiling and everyone's coming over and being like, you're such a dynamic drummer. It's so great. We're really listening to you, all this stuff. And it's fun. I don't resent having to prove myself over and over again. I think it's fun because I love to buck the stereotype, but like that gig with Kristen is the best thing I get to do because it's either playing with an orchestra, which is for me, those gigs are my favorite. And a very close second is when we travel with the 5-piece band, which is Maria Mitchell, and then Brian Ham on bass, Eric Davis on guitar, and Justin Smith on violin.
Brian Ham.
Yeah.
I haven't seen him since Rent. I think we sub Rent together. Great player.
Great player and great guys. And it's the dream. You're just going around and the music making is at just the highest level. And you can't not be at your highest game because it's Kristen and she sounds perfect every time. And she's so loose. You would never know it, but she's so loose in terms of, she'll just be like, I don't want to sing that tonight. Let's just do this. And some places she's, what about this song? A song we've never done. And we'll just throw together a sound check. And if she's in the mood to sing or if her voice is bothering, you would never know when her voice is bothering her by listening. But if her voice is bothering her, for her, she'll pick all different songs to sing than what we normally do. And you just got to be ready to do it. And everyone's in it together and you're always listening. And she never does. Every breath, every pullback, you have to be listening and present. And there's nothing more fun than that challenge of having, it because you do the same thing of having to listen and be present. And so that of all my gigs I do is far and away my favorite. I'm just so fortunate to get to play with her. So,
One of my favorite gigs I've done over the past 5 or 6 years was subbing for you at SpongeBob SquarePants. My God, that show was so much fun. Not only was the show fun, it looked from the audience, because one thing a lot of drummers on Broadway don't do, or musicians in general, they never see their shows. Why? Because they don't want to know what's going on outside of the audience. So I'm playing all this stuff and can't hear it. And you go, oh man, I don't want to do this anymore. But fortunately for us, we can hear everything that we do because we're the drummers. But man, that show was so much fun and was so much fun subbing for you. And of course, me having to go back to my technique in junior high and learn how to play traditional again.
You could flatten the drum out, man. You could have flattened the drum out.
No way. I wasn't going to know. That thing was like a 90-degree angle. No, it was a lot of fun. Just the challenge of that too. There's a lot of stuff on that show was very challenging. Not only the electric pad that you had, it was a challenge for me, but it was a lot of fun because the music was fun. But tell me how you got involved in that show.
Oh man, that was another show that I got real lucky with. So I pretty much worked on every show Tom had ever done. The other one he had done was the cheerleading show, Bring It On. But I got to do the pre-production workshops for that. I just didn't do it because that was a tour and not a Broadway show and I didn't want to do a tour. So I'd worked on everything Tom had ever done. And then he was brought in, after the show had already been workshopped and stuff, Tom was brought in to SpongeBob to orchestrate it. And he told me he was working on the show. And I was so jealous. Tom and I met when we were kids and we're really close friends. And I feel really fortunate for that personal and professional relationship. But then when I didn't get to work on that show, I was like heartbroken because I was like, oh no. And I didn't have a gig at the time. So also financially, but it just sounded like fun. And there was this guy that was working on the show that was a Foley artist. And so he was doing what I had done on my shows, which was like, he was playing drums and he was also doing all the other stuff. And Tom said they had done a few workshops and stuff. And he said, down the line, it's very likely that I'm going to want to split that book up because the Foley artist can't really play all the drum grooves all the time if he's doing the Foley. And would you be interested? And I was like, of course, I'll be interested in doing anything you're doing. And so it eventually got to that point where it was slated for Broadway. And then Tom said, listen, we need to break this book up. And I've been the only other show I worked with, I was ridiculously lucky. My first show worked with someone else in the percussion section was with Buddy, where I was just like a nightly lesson on pocket, which has hugely influenced me to this day. I have to share really fast. The best thing Buddy taught me, I'm sorry, I'm so tangential, but I remember this is a visual thing. So Buddy said someone told him this on one of his first gigs at a early recording session. He said, you show up, you shut up, and you play the music. And this one is the hardest, which is one of the funniest things but it's so true. But anyway, so Buddy, I got to work with Buddy, and then I got to work with Billy Miller on Addams Family. Billy played percussion, which was a dream. And then, so I'm coming into this new situation where I'm going to have to work with a percussionist. And Tom had said, think of some percussion stuff he could do for tunes when he's not playing drums. When he's not playing Foley stuff, because I want to utilize him. I don't want him just to be there for the Foley stuff. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know what this guy can do. I didn't know. We met in the very first rehearsal. It was just like instant chemistry. And Mike Dobson is such an amazing percussionist. And he was so brilliant at that and all the Foley stuff he did. You got to play with him. His pocket is fantastic. Like he's so much, because he thinks like a drummer. So when he's playing percussion, he's putting it where you would put it. And anyway, so Tom brought me in and my first time getting to do anything with it was at the first rehearsal in Chicago. And it was a really weird situation where the drums, because the Foley artist had to be on stage because he had to see the action, because he had to catch everything live. So he was where maybe the drums might have gone, but he was visible on stage and the pit was whatever size the pit was. And so I was in like a second sub basement in a room by myself in Chicago. And I had never seen the show. I had never heard the music. And so we had these headphones and we're talking to each other, me and Mike Dobson, and then the great music director, Julie McBride was music directing and Marco Piglia was playing keys. And so the four of us were just talking. And so we would be have to start the first song and I'd be like, all right, Mike, what's the feel on this? And then he would tell me and Marco would play a little bit of the groove on piano with it muted in the house. And then we'd start the first tune. And Tom had written out drum charts, but it was a situation where I wrote out like the parts that were on the demos that were given. He basically transcribed the demos that he got, which were mostly programmed drums. And he's like, so when you hear it, you'll know what to do with it. Thing. But I didn't get to hear it till we were like in rehearsals on stage, like in tech rehearsals. It was really crazy. So it was a different kind of challenge. And Mike Dobson talked through the vibes, and then he'd be like, this is what I did, but you might want to do blah, blah, blah. And then like in between, I would run out of my sub basement up one level to where Tom was like orchestrating. And I'd be like, can you play me the demo for this section? And then he'd play it. And then I run back down. So it was really fun, but it's itself a different way of putting the show together. But I had Tom and I had the demos and I had Dobson to guide me. And Dobson was just so great. All the Foley stuff he did was so cool. And that music was so much fun.
Oh my God. Yeah. Almost every song was so much fun to play and
yeah,
good times.
Yeah, man, you killed that show. Everybody loved when they'd be like, "You're out. Who's coming in?" And oh, awesome.
Oh man.
They liked everybody. I shouldn't say it like that. Everyone obviously loved playing with you.
I appreciate the opportunity, and it was I still just think back to those songs in that era, and thank you for having me. But
oh man, I loved your playing. I saw you play Memphis, and I remember playing with you at Color Purple, and that was like so great. But then getting to just sit back and watch you play at Memphis and just listen. That's why I said I feel like you got this bounce that is just so joyful. And I was like, I remember when I asked you, I was like, don't play it too much better than me because I want them to still want me to come back.
I remember you saying that too. That's funny. I can't play that show. Jagged Little Pill. That music from the time that we were younger, and I'm sure you listened to that album a lot. Did you take a lot of the same grooves from the album and transfer it to the Broadway show?
This was a unique situation because even though SpongeBob was a bunch of pop tunes, they weren't new tunes. They were new tunes. So you didn't have to reference anything in terms of what you were creating. But this was obviously, this record, it loomed huge for me. I was in college when I heard this record, and then grad school. And depending upon where I was in a relationship, like each different song was my favorite song at the time. And it was just like so huge in the zeitgeist. When Tom told me like a year before the first workshop, he's like, I have a meeting with Alanis Morissette about adapting. So this good friend of his had the idea and then approached Alanis people, and eventually she agreed to take a meeting and took a meeting with him, and it worked out. So then like Tom was going to get to meet her. And I was like, are you kidding me? It was the thrill we had when we started working on American Idiot, which I also worked on. I ended up not doing because the out of town conflicted with and my wedding. So I wasn't able to do that show, but I had done those drum parts and everything. And that was really exciting getting to meet that band. But then, so this was like getting to meet Alanis. Tom was getting to meet her. I wasn't getting to meet her. And he's we'll probably do a workshop, and maybe like if it goes well, like next year or something, would you want to do it? And I was like, that's the most ridiculous question you've ever asked me. Of course. So then when it was like finally going to happen, I was like, okay, I got to study this record. And it was really interesting because if you listen to it now, the story of that record is that a lot of the demos made it onto the record. And she and Glenn Ballard had like programmed drums and like live guitars and vocals over bass and drum loops and things. And Flea ended up coming in and playing some of the bass and different people, but they a lot of the stuff is loops. And then Glenn Ballard had done a session with this guy, Matt Log or Loff. I'm not sure how his name's pronounced. But so the live drums is this guy that just got lucky and got to do the session when he was like in his 20s, got called in to do a session for this unknown Canadian artist. And so when I went to listen to the album, I was like, okay, this is a good opportunity to do my little thing, which is like that idea of combining the percussionist and the drummer at the same time, only instead of a percussionist, I'm combining like loops and drums at the same time. And Tom had asked me if should I program the loops? And I was like, no, I don't want I want everything to be live. I want to recreate the loops. And then once I figure out how to recreate the loop, play the drum part on top of it. That was my thinking as a starting point, was like, figure out how to recreate the loop that sounds a little more organic and earthbound and grounded. And then put like a nice, simple, clean rock drum part on top of that. So that was my starting point. So I knew I had to have my djembe. And once again, Tom just let me do my thing. And if there was something that he wanted specifically, it was usually more along the lines of, can you not go to the cymbal yet? Or can you wait to drop the backbeat in until this part? Because he's also thinking about the story they're trying to tell, which is different than just the song on her record. It was absolutely thrilling getting to try to honor the original record. And then the other thing that I did was I went and watched as many videos as I could of the way she did the tunes live, which was then different because the way that like Taylor Hawkins played them was different than the record, which is really different than the way that Gary Novak played them. And then Matt Chamberlain also did some of her stuff. She's had the most amazing drummers. And so I just watched the way everyone approached them and thought about the record, and then thought about like, how is this context different? What are Brooke, the book writer, what are Brooke and Tom trying to tell in the story here? And what's too much? What gets in the way of the storytelling? What supports it in the right way? And how can I maybe even in this context, like, kick it up a notch from where the record was? Because that's the thing about the record is they're great, but because a lot of them are looped, they all stay here. And so in this show, you want it to have some sort of an arc. So that was my approach, was how can I put the loops and a drum part together, infuse it with some of how she does it live, and then tell the story that we're telling. So it was really awesome. And then there's like the one iconic drum fill, and you ought to know that I have that Tom wouldn't let me play on the record that I play live in the show. Tom wanted this bump bump instead of the clack clack the dum. Tom wanted this pump, and Tom is always the boss. So I did that for the record. But then in the show, I was like, if I don't play this dude, I'll have every drummer in the world saying, "What's wrong with it?" And he let me play the show, thankfully. It's really fun.
For those people who want to become musicians in the Broadway pit, especially drummers that are listening to this and watching this, what's some advice that you would like to give them? Like, what's the most important thing that someone should know about being a successful drummer on a Broadway show?
I think what served me the most was that I genuinely listened to all different types of music, not different shows, but different types of music. Because I think that you can make I don't want to say a mistake, but you're just skimming the surface if you're going to play a show that has Latin influence, let's say, and you just learn the Latin drum parts to that show. Like what Andres does in the Heights he's not playing a show. He knows how to play all those types of music. And then he put those feels and those ideas into the square box that is Broadway. He didn't learn to play Latin Broadway parts. And like, for me, Rent is a great show steeped in 80s pop, but it's not 80s rock. It's still a Broadway show that is influenced by the rock genre, but it's not rock. If you want to learn to play Rent, listen to 80s rock that would have influenced the composer, and then go play those drum parts with that in the back of your mind, and that in your pelvis, and that in your chest when you play those parts. And I think that's incredibly true for anything that's jazz based, especially. Like, Broadway swing is not swing music. So if you can go back and play along with Count Basie and find that pocket, and then when you play an early Broadway swing, you understand where that type of swing is coming from. So I think the biggest thing is don't study Broadway music, study music. And then when you're playing a show that is a specific genre, listen to music that influenced that genre and go back as far as you can. Like when I was in Absolute Ensemble, we got to play with Marcel Khalife, who is like the Bob Dylan of Lebanon. He's like a national icon, folk singer, musician, composer. And so I was like, okay, we're playing with Marcel Khalife. Let me get his records. And I listened to it, and it had all this darbuka flavor in the drum set. And I was like, let me go back a step. And then I like tried to listen to some like folk singers, Lebanese folk singers. And then I was like, hey, and I went back into the earliest stuff I could find of that, which is just like this female singer, like field recordings of a female singer and somebody playing a single rick recorded in like the mountains of Lebanon in the 1915 or something like that. So you understand where it comes from. And then when you get up to today's point, because they've also listened to rock music and all the stuff you grew up listening to, you understand where the kernel came from. So for me, that's my biggest thing, I think. And I still do that now, like I did for Jagged Little Pill. I didn't just listen to the record and learn that record. I was like, let me find every live performance I can find. Let me figure out what these loops are doing. Let me think about the style of those. And then you put it together, and then you make your own choice but it's a more informed choice. So you're coming from somewhere. And when I need a refresher, I definitely don't listen to like my recording of this thing. I'm going to listen to Gary Novak or Taylor Hawkins playing it live to remember where that like impetus came from that made a stadium full of people scream, you know?
That was one of the more important things that I got from subbing at SpongeBob is that all of those songs had a different feel and they come from different genres. You had the gospel thing, you had the modern pop thing, you had Aerosmith. And if you know how to play those styles, it becomes easier to fit in when you're required to play that open hi-hat on, what's that song, the Aerosmith song?
Oh, I don't remember, but I know what you're talking about. The Electric Skates tune.
Yes. What are things that drummers should never do in a Broadway?
One of them is, it goes off that Buddy quote. This lesson took me quite a while to learn. I'll be honest. It was something that I had trouble with. And I had to have two close friends that are much more important than me. I don't want to say sit me down, but sit me down and tell me this, which is that nobody cares what you think. That's a really big one. And part of it was because my first real Broadway show, Color Purple, I was hired specifically because Don Bird wanted to know what I was thinking and what I wanted to play. And then my second show was Next to Normal, which I had helped create. And so I thought that my opinion and ideas were welcome. And if you're talking just like the bass player, it might be, but don't talk beyond your peers because it's not. You're not there. We all know this as musicians because musicians have a sense of rhythm and timing. And we can feel right away in a reading when a scene doesn't make sense because it's not sitting in the flow correctly, or the style of song, or even just a single line just is making a hiccup in the flow of a scene. We can feel it right away. We can probably fix that. And stage crew, maybe even equally, stage crew can always tell like that song doesn't belong to the show. Like they always know, which is the dud. But nobody cares what we think because we're not the creative team. And it's really hard to learn. I don't want to say it like this, but it is a little bit of you have to learn your place. And our place is do your job and do a good job doing that. I think that's one of the biggest things. That's a lesson that took me the longest to learn. I was never saying anything bad, but I was expressing my opinions alongside of the creative team. And then I had to be told, everybody loves your playing and everyone loves you, but you can't tell people what you think about stuff. And I was like, it was hard. I felt like I was 5. I felt embarrassed and stupid, and then I was going to get fired. But it's just part of the scene, and that's the truth. And I think that's important also. That's why we all have side projects, so that we have a place where your opinion is what matters. That's why I have a band with Lauren Patton, and we have a gig in a couple of weeks, and we have a text chain this morning where we're all deciding, what are we going to play? No, I don't think so. This is why. What about this? So that you can have a place where your creative input is valued. And I know that my musical creative input is valued on the shows that I get to work on. But beyond that, it's a hard lesson, but you can't have an opinion. You can have it, you just can't express it. I think that one. And the other thing is to just respect the MD, even if you don't agree with them, to respect them and do what is asked. And if you don't want to, then take yourself out of the situation and go to another show or do something else.
A segue, but what are things that drummers should always do in a Broadway pit? Speaking of the MD,
follow the MD. Always be super. I mean, if you're subbing, just be more prepared than you ever think you possibly need to be. You should be. I remember my first show that I subbed on Broadway was Aida. And it's still probably to this day my favorite show I've ever played. Gary Seligson just wrote coolest frickin' book for that show and played the piss out of it. And that pit was so awesome. But I remember playing my first show and the music director coming down afterwards and being like, can you just tell me how you prepared for this? Because it just seemed like you knew the show. And I was like, just practice it every day for 2 weeks. Like it just seemed like such an obvious answer, but it was like, I had 2 weeks to learn a show. It was a situation where some of his subs got fired, and I had watched the show like 2 years earlier, and he was like, "Do you still want to learn this book?" And I was like, "Sure." And I had 2 weeks to learn it, so I just practiced every day, and that's what I practiced, and I came in and learned it. So I was just like, being hyper prepared is a big thing, and I think this goes along with what I was saying about like when you asked about how do you not have it be a job, but like just always remember that like for at least one person, but probably several hundred, this is the first Broadway show they've ever seen. And so every show should be your first show. Like you should play it with as much care and attention to detail and mental presence as you do after you've done it 100 times, if you're lucky to do it 100 times. I think that's really huge to just, if you don't want to be there, don't take the gig, but always show up like knowing it's someone's first show or it's someone's anniversary or somebody saved up for months to be able to afford to buy this ticket, and just play the show with the most respect you possibly can for the material. Because that's what it's really about. You're just a hired hand. You're just there to communicate the larger vision of the show. And Tim, my teacher again, Tim Adams, he said something to me once about, he said, "We're just hired help." He goes, "When you play a gig, where do you enter? Through the kitchen door. It doesn't matter that you're up on the stage, but you enter through that kitchen door, you're hired help." He's like, even for me, I'm up here on stage, but I have to wear this tuxedo because I'm hired help. And this is what the patrons that pay the bulk of our salaries want to see us wear, is this tuxedo. So I'm hired help. No matter what you are, you're hired help. And I think that just keeps me humble. Like I never, ever, not that I would ever possibly think I'm great, but that, I think that always helps. Anytime that I'm like, "Oh, this gig is beneath me," or playing the show again or whatever, it's like somebody's first show. If there's 5 people in the crowd, man, they wanted to be there and you play that show for them. Just like to treat every gig is to be thankful for it. And I felt this way before COVID, but even more now, it's like a real awareness of that sort of like just appreciation and gratefulness without being in any way hokey taggy. Like it's like I really am someone that's always grateful every time I get to play. So
what kind of drum gear do you use and why do you use it? And do you have any endorsements?
That's a cool question. I pretty much mostly just play vintage drums. I just love the old, warm, resonant, punchy sounds of old drums. So I mostly play vintage Gretsch drums in terms of bass drums and toms. They're all vintage Gretsch. The kit that I use those vintage drums for next to normal, but otherwise I always use this really great Ames kit, which I guess is technically vintage now since it's the 80s, but it's not, I'm talking like when I say vintage, like 50s, 60s. This great Ames kit that sounds really warm. And I like smaller drum sizes. I like to use smaller drums that have die-cast tubes that I can tune down. So they have just a punch, but also a lot of resonance. So that way you don't have to hit them hard. And I'm sure that it comes from my 8 years practicing timpani every day, but it's just about getting the most tone that I can out of the drum without having to hit hard. I think you can weigh in on this, but one of the most common comments I get every time a sub watches my book to learn is, "Wow, you really don't hit very hard. Like you don't play very loudly, but it sounds like I am because I'm getting a big sound." So I am 100% about tone and sound. So I want my drums to sound good. So I play vintage Gretsch drums or these Ames. My rider for all my gigs are Yamaha Absolute Custom Maple Custom Absolute. They're my absolute favorite non-vintage drum. No matter where I am, no matter what kit I get, I can always make them sound good in 5 minutes with just a little tweaking of the heads. They always sound good in 5 minutes. I would love more than anything to have a Yamaha endorsement, not because I want another set of drums, but just so that whenever I go somewhere to make sure I get those drums. But I love those drums so much. Those are my favorite non-vintage drums. And then my snares are I'm a vintage snare geek, and I just have way too many drums back, like from like a 1920s leady to all different flavored brass and chrome brass. I mostly like Snarland and Ludwig, but I have a few Gretsch and leadies thrown in there.
So yeah, that snare drum at SpongeBob was a Noble and Cooley, right?
That was a Noble and Cooley. Yeah, that was my high school graduation present that I got. Yeah, I got that drum. That's a gorgeous, versatile drum. I use that a lot. And then I probably technically still do have a percussion endorsement through Toka. I haven't wanted or needed any new percussion gear in so long, but I got all my stuff through Toka a lot of years ago when I was playing in Barry Manilow's band and I was his percussionist for a little while. I got that endorsement and their stuff is great. I love it. When I use congas in my setups, I use my Toka congas always. And then I had a Zildjian deal. I don't think I have that one anymore. For me, I just didn't keep that up because I found that I could never play just one cymbal brand. And that's just me. It's just my ear. But I just really love a whole different wash of colors. So like on my kit at Jagged, I've got Zildjian, Heisty, Sabian, and Istanbul. So I've got lots of different things. I just like different colors. So I mix and match until it sounds like the palette that I want.
That's great. I never even thought about using multiple companies.
Yeah. I just find, for me, nobody does a ride better than Zildjian. Like all my old rides just sound so great. And even the newer Ks and Constantinople's like sound great. But then for a splash, like Sabian and Istanbul splashes they have so much character. So like I go with those for splashes. And then I like some really old Zildjian hats that I have. But then Heisty crashes are so cool and they have all these different lines. And it's fun when I mix a Heisty with a Sabian crash. They have such different like overtone profiles that when you play them together, sometimes when you play crash, it becomes a wash. And I like to hear the entrance of each instrument. If I'm hitting this crash and then that crash, it's because I'm making another comment. I don't just want to wash. So I like to be able to mix and match them so that you hear each voice. One thing talking about one in the email you sent, you said, you asked what my favorite show to play was, but I have to say my favorite show that I would like to play that I've never got to play is Hedwig. When that show came back to Broadway, I was like, I want to play that show. How can I play that show? But they came back with the band all intact. But man, I remember hearing that score and being like, it's if T-Rex and David Bowie wrote a musical together. It's so cool. So that's my favorite show I've never got to play. I'll say that.
Interesting.
What would be yours? What favorite show have you never got to play that you want to play?
That's a good question. It's kind of an interesting question. I used to come up with these ideas, but I don't want to do it anymore because I'm coming up with all these ideas, and one day it's going to be an actual thing. Just joking about, yeah, man, I wish there was a P-Funk musical because I don't know what happened to the Mothership Connection, and I think it was supposed to be George Clinton's legal things were always a nightmare. That would be a wonderful thing, but I was, what about a Rush musical?
Yeah.
Pictures the musical. But then I got to stop talking like that because we have Tina, we have Jagged Little Pill, we have American Idiot. All these bands from classic rock or pop artists now have their own musicals.
Sting, Last Ship.
What's that?
Sting.
Yeah, Sting, exactly. Now I hear Bryan Adams has something and Don McLean, and I'm like, so anyway, I couldn't play a Rush musical, but everybody's, you know who you need to have on that? Joe Bergen.
Oh yeah, because he was his man. He was his drum tech. Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, I wouldn't mind a funk musical.
That'd be pretty sweet. I'll step in for the Yes musical because
now we're talking.
Bill Bruford is Bill Bruford and Stuart Copeland are my other gigantic influences, and those guys, I'll step in for their musicals. Fragile the musical. Yeah.
Close to the Edge or Synchronicity the musical.
Synchronicity. Yeah, that's a little more straight ahead, but I can take that. As long as we throw in some of their early stuff.
Next to you. What's the first song on the first album? Yes. Oh, on.
All that's, yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
I digress.
There's a lot of Stuart Copeland in my drum parts.
I heard that Taylor Hawkins was a big Stuart Copeland fan, or is a big Stuart Copeland fan, and a lot of stuff that he played on a lot of the Foo Fighters stuff He said, yeah, I got that from Stuart Copeland playing on the bell, the cymbal. And I was like, nah, I listen to it and I hear it.
Yeah.
It's always interesting to hear people's influences. That's why I'm glad I talked to you. I understand you much better than I used to.
It's all of that, though. It's that's fun, though. It's when actors do roles, they do good ones. They do so much research, and they ride in a cop car, or they go to the office, or they read papers and books that they get. It's like musicians just get the music and then learn the notes. But there's so much more. And I feel like that's something that my classical training really did for me, is I brought over the respect for the material and the element of a thorough study I bring to whatever genre of music I'm playing. And I think that just it helps make it more interesting for me. And I think that it communicates more to people that are listening. I feel like it does. Something does.
I always like to find out what the origins of things are. Like, for instance, you think about somebody like Taylor Hawkins. And who was he listening to? He was listening to somebody like Stuart Copeland. Now, who was Stuart Copeland listening to? When you hear like people like Neil Peart and people he liked, the drummer for the Who, Keith Moon. And then you see where he got his sound.
Makes all sense.
And then who did Keith Moon and John Bonham like? They liked the jazz drummers.
Yeah.
And then those drummers, who did they listen to? You can go back to Joe Jones, and you can go back to Kenny Clark. Then you go back before that.
You got Zudi back at the beginning.
Yes.
And
so it's so interesting. And I think a lot of people would be better off doing some more homework and doing some more research, because everything just didn't start yesterday.
That's right.
And there's so much more to learn, and just these conversations I enjoy having, because I get to learn more about people and get to learn. I spoke to somebody else a couple of days ago about classical percussion, and I didn't realize the timpanist is like the main person in the drums. It's not the drum section, percussion section of the orchestra, correct?
There's percussion. There's a percussion section. And separate from that is the timpanist. And in the percussion section, you usually have a principal, and then an assistant principal, and then one or two section players, depending upon the size of the orchestra and what their budget is. And the assistant principal percussionist is also usually the assistant principal timpanist. But the principal timpanist is very frequently the second highest paid person in the orchestra after the concertmaster. Because the timpanist is the tonal and the rhythmic center of the orchestra. Where the timpanist puts the note in relationship to the conductor's baton is basically the pocket of that orchestra, if you think about it. And everyone, if it's an orchestra that listens, obviously the timpanist isn't ignoring everyone else, but it's about, when I was a timpanist, like I would be thinking like, am I playing with brass right now? I should breathe and think of the tension required with my lips to make a sound come out of a brass instrument. That's how I'm going to play and where I'm going to put that. Am I playing with the strings? Okay, that's about lifting and placing a bow and friction and weight. So I'm going to play it like that. But because our instrument speaks immediately, where we put it, we have to wait or anticipate or place right in the middle of the pocket. And that is the beginning of the sound and the placement for the whole orchestra sound, right? And so the timpanist really determines so much of the character of an orchestra signature sound, which is why when I heard Cloyd Duff play, I started buying every Cleveland Orchestra recording I could to understand, like, how does he shape and move that orchestra, as opposed to Saul Goodman in the New York Phil, or as opposed to Hinger in Philly, or and all these different orchestras. And it was so illuminating. And that's still what I think of when I'm playing with a pit band. It's a little different because we have a click. So then you're in relation to a click. But when I'm playing with an orchestra with Kristen, and I'm like, okay, I need to leap forward and bring the orchestra with me here. Okay, I need to make sure that my snare drum is a little bit later so that the string players relax in this part of the tune, because I know Kristen's going to get soupy here and whatever. And I think that is like 1,000,000% informed the drum set player I am, is thinking like a timpanist, because the timpanist's job is to be the tonal and rhythmic center of a full orchestra. And that's a lot of responsibility. It helps your ensemble playing so much when you think like that. And it also is really telling when you get a music director that has never done that, you get a music director that hasn't had a lot of practice listening and breathing and reacting and has only done like cabarets and following singers, right? Because it's a real different thing. And then you get someone, you get to like Sheldon all the time. So someone like him that's like listening and like music directing by where he puts things, not by where he shows things. And it's a whole different experience.
Yeah. Where can people find you? And do you give lessons in social media other than Facebook?
Oh man. I wouldn't say that I'm like Gene Hackman in the conversation, but I give credit to an extent. I'm on Facebook, and that's probably like the easiest way to find me. And one of the reasons I stay on Facebook, to be perfectly honest, is I do find that I get work through there because it's an easy place to find people. So it's just Damien Bassman, Damien Bassman on my Facebook, and you can find me there. And I don't do very much promoting of what I'm doing, but I do usually promote when my band plays. So I will always post like, if I'm playing with like Lauren or something like that's my project. But no, I'm not on Twitter or Instagram or I don't have
Snapchat, TikTok.
Yes, you can find me on Friendster.
MySpace.
My MySpace page is still there somewhere. Yeah, no, and it's not anything against it. I just like, I just am. It's just one more thing that you have to look at all the time. That it takes me out of being present where I am, and I have enough pull from the phone with just texting and emails that I don't. For me personally, I just don't need too many other options. But Facebook is a great way to get in touch with me and find out what I'm doing, and email, whatever. But yeah, that's about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Damien Bassman, the amazing person. I love this chat, and thank you for taking time out. And I'm looking forward to actually seeing you in person outside of the grocery store. Last time we saw each other was at the old Fairway on 125th Street. That was during
all messed up and in the like survival mode shopping.
I was getting a whole like series of toilet paper. No, I'm just joking. Anyway, thanks again, and we will definitely talk soon.
Thank you for having me, man. It was really a pleasure, man. Always talking to you.
All right, we'll talk. Thanks.